Hey, so I thought I'd put together a quick video just sort of going through what my tool set is and what my process is for firstly product managing and secondly actually building with AI at the moment. I'll kind of preface this by saying like this is my opinion and put tool set on what I think works best for me at the moment. There are so many different tools out there. This is not a kind of instruction on this is the way to do it. However, some of the things that I'm using and some of the processes that I've developed over the last few months, I found to be incredibly helpful. So I thought I'd just share how I'm actually approaching building at the moment. So I'm just going to jump into Miro. I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams. And first, I should say I didn't create these diagrams. I got Claude to use the Miro MCP to build those. Perfect example of taking sort of a conversational process with an LLM like Claude, and then using that to build up practical usable interfaces. So in this case, what I'm doing is I've split this down into a few phases. So this is assuming you're kind of going from scratch. And the first thing I'd do, but this works for sort of building out a new app from scratch or just building out a new feature. I've got my ideation phase. So in fact, I'm just going to silence those. Okay, got Slack notifications paused. So starting off in this ideation phase. So first of all, I'm typically starting off in Claude Web because I like the interface, but Claude Desktop, Claude Code doesn't really matter. And the same thing could be with ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever tool you're using. I really like Claude because in particular, I think the skills are really, really useful. So I'll touch on that a little bit later. But also because I think that currently models like 4.5 Opus are incredibly good at writing good code and also just getting that sort of level of interaction. The Claude SDK is also fantastic. So the tool set that's being built around Claude's LLM, I think is really, really good at the moment. So that's what I'm primarily using. So I'm using my product manager skill, which is a custom skill that I built, which is basically built out of examples of what I want it to do in the context that I want it to have when I'm building products requirements documentation. And what that actually does is effectively does a stakeholder interview with me. So it'll ask me questions, it'll ask me about edge cases and start to build up that requirements documentation. Out the back of that, I'll come out with a PRD document. So that's literally me instructing what I want this feature or this app that I'm building to do. So the way that I generally treat this in terms of splitting down into sort of apps, features, whatever, I start off with sort of a PRD, which might cover the entire application. And then I'll slim that down into smaller PRDs that cover feature sets or individual smaller chunks of that I want to build. So I'll then create a GitHub repo and I'll add that PRD and any of the docs in a docs directory within that repo. So when I say any of the docs, sometimes, and again, this depends on what you're doing. So if I'm just building a quick one-shot little mini prototype of something that I just want to test, it might just be that we've just got the PRD and that's all I need. I don't need to create any of the documentation. Or it might be that if I'm, building out something a bit more featured, if it's a feature within a app that I'm already building that I've got the user interface that I want to design. So it might include mock-ups of that UI within that docs directory in code so that there's appropriate context for the LLM to actually read. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. Then primarily I'm actually working in VS Code with the Claude Code plugin, and I'll show you what that looks like. Again, I've played with lots of different ways of doing this, and I kind of chop and change throughout the day. I think the Claude Code plugin is really good because it's just got a really nice interface for actually interacting with it, and VS Code's a great place to read and work with code and run locally. I just think that's an easy way to do it at the moment. As I say, that might change. So Claude Code you can now use in their own cloud IDE instead. I haven't really played with that yet, but I will play with that in the next couple of weeks, and that might change my mind a little bit. There's also Claude Code running in the terminal as well, which is exactly the same thing as the plugin. It's just I think the plugin has a nice UI. I then move on to using the issue creator skill. So again, this is another custom Claude skill that I built, which is to say, okay, you've got this PRD. I now want you to work with Linear, which is where I like to keep my tickets. And I want you to use Claude's MCP, Linear's MCP to use Claude to talk to Linear and actually build out the issues that are going to build this feature or this project or whatever we're doing. So again, I'll show you what that looks like. I use that because Linear is a really nice way, a really sort of simple UI for tracking tickets, a little bit like Jira if you work with that, except I think it's a nicer, cleaner UI. It's a little bit less complex and full featured, but you can still do most of what you want to do just with something that's easier to work with. Then there's kind of an optional bit here that I've added in, which is the issue reviewer skill. Now, what I found is if you ask an LLM to check its own homework within the same chat context, it doesn't necessarily do a great job. Ultimately, we've got to kind of remember LLMs are based on human interactions. You ask a human to check its own work, they don't tend to do a great job. So what I sometimes do, and again, this is tends to be later on when you're working within an existing project, you've got an existing code base, is I'll use this issue reviewer skill in a separate Claude code chat to look back at the issues that I've just written and really check them for accuracy. So in particular, we know that LLMs can make stuff up and get carried away. So I will check it against the actual requirements on the PRD, but also against the actual code base. So it might be that this involves a change to a model, in our app and in our database, but actually it's made some assumptions about what was already existing in those models because it got carried away. The issue reviewer skill will go and look in your existing code base and say, no, okay, let's check the differences here. There's something else, and it'll come back to you and say, what did you intend this to actually do? So as I said there, I'm writing this to Linear via their MCP. Then getting into the actual development loop. Predominantly, I'm going into Claude code saying, let's pick up this ticket. I'm letting it implement that ticket. And again, I'll have a custom set of instructions to say, when I ask you to pick up a ticket, move it to in progress when you've got to the end, the completion of that ticket. And that is defined on the acceptance criteria being met. It's defined on the unit test passing. Then I'll ask you to move it into human review. I'll then come in and have a look at that and say, and run the tests and run it locally and say whether I think it works or not, or what we need to actually change. There's not always stuff, and I'm finding more and more, in particular with 4.5 Opus, like a higher percentage of those tickets are kind of right first time now, which is great. But then I'll be able to then commit and push that and then ask it to move on to the next ticket. Again, you can automate all of that. You can have an agent just do it. I personally, in terms of my trust level with Claude Code, I'm not there that I'm just happy to let it absolutely run away, particularly with more mature products and with larger code bases. I think the larger the code base gets, the less good it gets at doing some of this stuff. And lastly, just to highlight, and I guess I've spoken to a few people about that this week, but what am I actually using in terms of architecture? And that kind of depends on what I'm trying to do with something, whether it's a little MVP to try something out, or whether it's a full featured app and I'm going to bring in an iOS front end or anything else. So typically, if I'm doing a tiny little MVP test feature thing, I will literally have a Next.js monolith architecture, so basically a combined front end and back end in one app, and I'll run that on Vercel. Typically for databases, I'm using Supabase mostly. MongoDB is another great option. Supabase is kind of where I'm moving towards now as my preferred option, just because it will handle so much for you in terms of things like authentication, that it's just nice to not have to mess around with. As I get larger, I might start to strip out some of those backend functions. So what I have been using is containerized Express JS backend. Again, this works very nicely in terms of Claude works well with Express.js, and then running that on AWS App Runner. Increasingly, I'm moving towards Fly.io. Again, I'm kind of on the fence on where I go with that. It's just that AWS, as we all know, is not that fun to work in. So I'm looking for other places we can actually do that. What is included on here is, of course, you'll have all of your other services as you might need. So that might be Stripe, emails. So emails predominantly at the moment, I'm using Loops. So Loops is really designed for sort of onboarding loops and that sort of thing. However, it does transactional emails as well, really, really well. And it's really easy to set up because there's basically zero configuration. It's just an API. You visually design what your layouts will look like. It creates a unique link that you can use in that API, and then you can just pass through your variables that include in the email. I found that really easy and really nice to use. So my idea with this now is I'll kind of show you through an example of how I would build out a new app or a new feature set within something at the moment. Okay, so we're going to build a little app then, put that into practice. So as hopefully you've gathered by Brew, and I'm kind of obsessed with coffee. So we're going to build a really simple web app only app that allows me to track my espresso shots. So first thing I'm going to do is jump into Claude. Claude has already got my custom skills loaded into it. I've got those in my web version for Claude, but also in my local version of Claude Code. I'll produce another little video about skills maybe after this. So what I'm going to do is ask it to act as a product manager and help me specify what it's going to be. I'm going to try and do all of this as quick as possible. As I mentioned the other day, I will spend hours working on this spec before I actually build anything in real life, but we'll do a sort of condensed version of that. So I'm asking it to conduct that product interview with me, and then the outputs are going to be the PRD, which we actually then use to build it. Okay, cool. So we can see that we've come back with the high-level discovery questions that it's asking me. So core problems that we want to solve, who's the user going to be? Can we define those user personas? What is the outputs that we actually want to get out of this? What's in and out of scope? So I'm going to go ahead and answer those, and then we'll come back. So some time has passed. I got distracted with some other stuff as well, but I'm going to show you what's gone on in the meantime. So we've gone through a series of questions. As I say, typically if this was something real I was building, I'd spend quite a lot of time on this. But it's asked me, for example, that sort of high-level discovery, what problems am I actually trying to solve? Dig down into UI. Really interesting question that I think it asked this time, which I thought was I've not really seen before, but where it's asked me for any sort of equivalent apps with UX that I really already liked for quick data entry, which was, I think, a really great question. And then a little bit more about edge cases, some more specifics, and then looking into the future as well. What are the sort of things we might want to add after this MVP sort of prototype thing. So I'm going to show you what the outputs were. First was these mock-up UI designs, which, to be honest, for this sort of first pass for a little demo, this is kind of great. So I asked it to prioritize mobile interface, because this is the sort of thing you'd be using in the kitchen next to your grinder. You're not going to use it on a laptop, but typically I design this for multiple screen sizes as well. So it's giving me the few screens, the kind of what it's going to look like to click through to log a shot and to go through this process. And actually, it's pretty much nailed what I might like for this first pass. And then the second output is, excuse me, let me find it, is the PRD. So again, typically I'd go through a process now of reading and reviewing this, coming back with questions and issues that I have. But sort of in terms of those outputs that I'm getting from this, and this is based on the examples that it's got within the product manager skill, is what's in scope, what's out of scope, who are our user personas, where it should look at for our UI mockups, what are the colors and design system that we're going to use, what typography. Then it'll break down into functional requirements, so those priority things that we want to see getting done as part of that build, and the user experience flow. So it's coming out with some mermaid flow charts here, and then it will start to actually define as well a database schema, so what this will actually look like when we build it out, and then finally those testing requirements, what that's actually going to look like. So at this point, as I say, typically I go through a series of iterations now, but we're going to move over into VS Code and using Claude Code to build out the next section. Okay, cool. So we're in VS Code. We're in a lovely, fresh new repo. So I've just set up a Git repo within my sort of GitHub directory. And all I've actually done here is, firstly, within VS Code, I've got my Claude Code plugin. So I'm logged into my Claude Code account. As I say, there's loads of other ways you can interact with this, and the terminal is really easy. I just like the interface as it is now. The other thing that I've done is I've added a couple of MCPs. So you can see that all I've got in are the linear server and Context7. So I'll talk about linear in a moment. Context7 is really cool. So basically, it's just a library of all of the most up-to-date documentation documentation for all of the frameworks that we might use to build in. And this basically means that unlike sort of relying on LLMs, which will typically go back to perhaps 6 months to a year old documentation that's within their context, if you instruct it to look at Context7, you can do this in your custom instructions for the LLM. It will get the latest set of documentation and use the latest releases of the frameworks that we might use. So that's super useful. And linear, as I said before, so linear is just where we're going to track our issues, and this allows us to actually talk to our linear setup and create and manage and use issues. The other things I've done here that you can see is I've dragged in the mockups that we had, the output from working with Claude in the web, and the MD, so the other output that we had there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually run init, which basically is just setting up the first set of documentation that Claude will refer to use itself. Because there's nothing in here, it won't be particularly well, it won't be fleshed out at all. There won't be anything of real interest in there. But what we'll do is ask Claude to maintain itself, and when it comes across, for example, bugs it's solved and things that it might want to deal with those in the same way again, or for example, we'll give it instructions on how to handle tickets within linear. Then it will use that set of instructions moving forward, which allows you to sort of customize how it works. Okay, so made a couple of changes there. So we've got the initialized Claude file now, and all about it in there is just some specifics around how to actually handle states of issues. So now I'm going to ask it to work with the linear NCP. So create a new project within our team, use the PRD as that's the basis for that project, and then use the issue creator skill to create linear issues to actually implement it. Again, this is included in the skill, but it's well worth sort of kind of reinforcing for the IAM LLM that all issues have acceptance criteria and basic unit testing. Another thing here, and again, this is optional, but you'll tend to find by default, and looking at the PRD, this is exactly what's happened. It's picked a version of Next.js, which is 2 major versions behind the most modern ones. So I'm telling it to go to Context7, check what the most up-to-date versions of Next.js are that are stable, and actually use that rather than what it would just use if it had its way. So we're going to start that going now, and this is probably a prompt which is going to take it a little while because there's a lot of things that it's going to have to do now. It's also worth saying that some of these MCP servers, as great as they are, they're going to use a really big chunk of your context window when you're working with these LLMs. So particularly Context7. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that the more you use these, the more you're using up those prompts. So it might be worth farming some of this out to sub-agents. So I've left that running for a couple of minutes now, and I just wanted to show part of this process. So we're using the skills, so it will ask you questions as you go forward. So for example, it's going to ask us what level of granularity we prefer. We're going to get to feature level for this. What priority should be assigned to P0. Let's go for urgent, submit, and it will carry on. So we'll go through this process. We'll leave it again to run in a moment. It's going to create these issues one by one now. Okay, so we've let that run for probably about 10-15 minutes now, and we're jumping into linear. So this is what linear looks like, and we're within a project here. So this is the BrewTrackr MVP project that we've set up, and we can see that it's brought in that PRD document in a shorter form into that project description. And so what we've also got is our issues. So we've got our first set of issues, our project setup. Every ticket is defined with exactly what our acceptance criteria is, what we want to see, the testing requirements at the end of it. What I would say now is typically I would then go through each of these tickets using the review skill and just get it to refine those, particularly if you're working in existing code base. For the purposes of time now, I'm not going to do that, and we'll just jump straight into building some of this stuff. So now we're back in VS Code, and we're going to get it going. So let's start implementing, I can't remember what I named the tickets. Was it TRK? TRK1. And we'll let it run. So then we'll come back and see when it's finished doing that first ticket. So that first ticket's done. We can see it thinks that it's completed everything. Looking back up, what it's done is, build out the app, install dependencies. Then it's run the test, run linting, and run a build of the app, and it's happy that the acceptance criteria all hit and the testing is going fine. So let's run it locally and see what happened. Cool. So there isn't much to see yet, but yeah, basically it's built out the app skeleton. So what I'm going to do now is something slightly different to how I would usually do it. And basically I'm just going to let it run and keep going until it's finished those tickets rather than reviewing each one, just for the sake of time. We'll come back in a bit and see how it's done. So it's actually a new day. I ran out of time to have a look at this yesterday evening. But basically I'm gonna show you what the outputs were of that. So firstly, if I jump into linear, you can see that it completed all but one of the tickets, which is super interesting. I haven't quite worked out why it didn't do that final one. So the last one that left out was the end-to-end UI testing suite, so using Playwright. Really interesting that it didn't. And actually, it's even more interesting because the remaining last couple of issues when I tried to run and test this for the first time were things that would have shown up if it had done that last ticket and done those Playwright tests. So that's really interesting. So as I say, I ran it first thing this morning, and basically pretty much everything worked apart from there were some hydration issues with the JavaScript on the form submit buttons, which was really interesting, and as I say, should have shown up in the end-to-end testing suite. Again, this probably would have been nailed if we'd spent a little bit more time on the ticket specification. So this is why I think it's actually really important to go in and review those tickets and get them right so that your output is better first time. But anyway, I felt those errors back into Claude, and within a few minutes it had resolved all of those. So let's spin up the local version and I'll show you what the outputs were. Okay, cool. So we're in Chrome now. You can see I've shrunk down the screen to mobile size just because that's what we optimized for. So I've already logged in and created an account, but that was just a typical sort of login screen. You can see we've got kind of exactly the user interface that we had designed using Claude. I've added my grinder in. I've started to add some beans. We've got things like those loading skeletons, exactly how we defined it. Let's go through the UI and actually log a shot. Let's have a look. We've selected the beans we wanted to use. Okay, let's say we grabbed it on 50 setting. Yeah, 5-star, great. That was the dialed in one. Not too bitter. Great. We've got our shot. We've got our shot history. Look, we can see our dialed in settings. Again, you're still going to end up with this situation like you can see with this little dialed in badge here, where you've got weird little UI things that don't work well. The one thing that I would say that Claude Code has started to do really well in the last couple of months is actually respond to screenshots as well. So if I screenshot this and took a clip of the bit of UI that I wasn't happy with, fed that back into Claude Code, we'd be able to resolve that pretty easily. The other thing I'd say about that is that, ultimately it's writing code. It's not using vision when it writes that code. So if you nail the UI design first, the outputs will be so much better. So what I'm doing on larger projects, and again, I might do a little video about this, is actually going through a process of designing that componentry in a lot more detail and actually maybe creating like Storybook, for example, with all of your componentry and your predefined UIs in code, so that it's what you see is what you get with that. The code has been written, it's been tested by myself. I've used AI to generate that code, but I've maybe gone in and tweaked things and worked with things like that where that badge looks a bit weird. But then you've got all of your components designed. I'd keep that then within the repo as a component library for the AI to use, and then that you're going to get this consistent behavior, and also that then if you want to go in and make those little tweaks and changes, that's going to happen across your app. Building this way as well, though, it is pretty good. It's not going to be the best code that you've ever seen in your life, but it's pretty good at building out properly by building out those component libraries, for example. So all the reusable stuff that you're going to want and that you're going to only ever going to want to change once and have that reflected across your app, it will do that. So that's just a really quick, I guess, introduction to my workflow. There's lots of bits I've skipped over there. As I say, I might put together another little quick video on Claude skills and maybe a little bit more on detail of that sort of building out that UI. But I think that shows quite well that yes, you've got to be a little bit more patient in this process. If it's not a sort of a one-shot thing of going and making a description into Replit or Lovable or something like that, and then going back and tweaking. But if you take the time to really nail those definitions up front, and so the AI knows exactly what you want up front, the outputs that you get are of a much greater quality earlier on, and you don't end up in this recurrent circle going back and trying to improve things and getting the yellow box where you want the yellow box. It's also worth mentioning that apps, as in native apps, are kind of a whole different space. Up until recently, it's been virtually impossible to build iOS apps using I think tools like Claude. That has changed in the last couple of months. So I have built and published on the App Store iOS apps now using Claude Code. It is way harder than building out web apps. Like, that is the simple reality of it, just because it hasn't got access to as much context. You also then end up switching between working in VS Code to actually write a bit of the code and building an Xcode, and because it can't see as much in terms of running its own builds and stuff, that makes it a slower, more iterative process. But the same sort of core principles of getting those definitions up front and then building those out work really well. One other last thing I'll mention, this example that I built here is really simple because it's a monolith app with the front end, the back end as a single app. Where you're building out more complicated app architectures, so maybe you've got your front end, your back end, you've got an Android app, maybe an iOS app. This may not be best practice. I'm not a developer by training, but what I tend to do is use a mono repo. So I've got a single GitHub repo. Within that, I've then got it split down into my front end app, my back end app, any microservices that I've got, my iOS app. And the reason that I do that is because your context is then accessible. Context is then accessible across everything that you're doing. So if you want to say, look, this hasn't worked how I wanted it to work in the iOS app, have a look at how we did this in the web app for how we implemented it. What did the models look like? What were the calls that we made to the Stripe API? And it can use its own examples then to improve the code, but also make it more consistent across all of the products that you're building within a project. I forgot to do a key really important thing there. Let's deploy it. So let's put it live. We're gonna deploy it to Vercel, and we'll just put it in a pre-production environment. I'm already logged into the Vercel command line interface here, so we are just going to select where it should be. Don't want it linked to an existing project. BrewTrackr is fine. It's in the root directory. No, it's all good. Okay, and we're going to deploy it. Cool. So I've skipped a little step there in that I've set up my Supabase account, which is going to be the database for this. So one of the outputs from Claude was this initial database schema, which I've run as migration in Supabase. It's really easy to do that process. Again, if you're not familiar with working with that, asking Claude to help you through that process is probably the easiest way. And then that's given me the credentials that I need to actually access it. So I pushed out that to Vercel, and I've stuck it on a production build on Vercel, and I've added my environmental variables for my Supabase. And let's try and log in and see if it works. So this is encouraging. Cool, we're in, and there's the stuff that we added. Obviously, it looks horrible on a full screen view, but yeah, on mobile, it's kind of exactly what we were expecting to see, and that's deployed in live. So you could even go and have a play at it. It's on BrewTrackr.vercel.app. I'll put a link to it on the description below. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And now we've got something that we can actually build on and build out the feature set as we want. And realistically, we've probably spent hands-on time, maybe half an hour maximum. In reality, as I say, I'd probably spend a lot more time building out those definitions, PRD, doing the issue review, and as I say, iOS is kind of like it's a different ball game at the moment because Claude simply isn't as good as building for iOS. iOS really doable. One thing I'd also say is like is my typical flow for that is I'm almost always in iOS building something which I've already built as a web app. So I'm using that web app, the functionality, the flows that I've already designed, and then getting Claude to define what that would look like in an iOS structure. So if you've got this in a web app, in that whole that iOS UI using Liquid Glass, how should that look? Define how it should look, and then build from that, which is as I say is totally doable now. So yeah, I hope that's been useful. I hope you've enjoyed it. Any questions? Please just get in touch with me.